authority in our society. They determine who gets access to resources. They force us to look at our identity in futures in ways that we might take for granted, and yet we're often not aware of these stories. What I wanted to do in this presentation was to render visible these diagnostic narratives that maybe you've never thought of before. I'm hoping that you haven't thought of them, because otherwise I wouldn't be bringing anything novel to you. But they're there, they're prevalent, they're everywhere in society. They're everywhere. And I think about it, I'm going to talk to you about diagnostic narratives as they exist in illness narratives, as they exist in medical narratives, as they exist on television, in film, in fiction, just everywhere. And I'll just give you a little Exeter story as a kind of precursor. When I was here last time, I stayed with my colleague, and she had a stack of wonderful books on the top of the dresser, and she said, take any one, you know, read them. These are things people have left behind or we've already read. And I picked up the first one, and diagnosis was on page 2. And there was a very important diagnosis story that threaded through the random book that I picked up from my colleague's dresser, or the book that I picked up from the giveaway pile in North Beverly, Massachusetts, where my sister lives, was a crime thriller. I thought, oh, great, crime thriller, I'll take that in the plane on the way home. The diagnosis was on page 7. I picked up another book in the airport, because it's a long-haul flight to New Zealand. You need a few books to get from one end to the other. And the very same thing happened. Diagnosis is a trope in many of the things we read, and you're thinking, oh, diagnosis, when did I last see diagnosis in a book? Don't worry, henceforth you'll see it everywhere. Okay, so as I reveal the presence of these diagnostic narratives, I'm going to, I hope, demonstrate their influence. That's the point. So I'm going to start with a story. Let's just make sure this is going to change slides. There we go. You can see this picture. You don't need a subtitle, do you? This is a doctor, that's a patient. You can imagine what he's been told. Anyone wondering? He's been given a serious diagnosis. But let's pretend it's today, and let's pretend it's you or me. Now, we've gone to the doctor because we've had a set of confusing physical symptoms. They've worried us a little bit. None of them were terribly serious on their own, but altogether they were kind of adding up to a worrisome total. You've gone to the doctor that agreed that a diagnostic workup was probably in order. You've had an x-ray, maybe a scan, you've had some blood work done, and the results are back. You've gotten a call. In my country, the nurse would call, or the receptionist would call and say, you know, the results are in, here's an appointment, you're going to meet with Dr. Chan, and he'll talk to you about what's going on. So, you're in the doctor's office awaiting the verdict. You can imagine that, can't you? Now, you're probably at the same time saying, oh, I'm sure it's nothing. And then you're thinking, maybe it's something. So we've probably all rehearsed a story like that in our heads. We've, what would we do, say, feel, think, if the doctor were to say, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you've got, I'm not going to say it out loud because of magical thinking. That would be to jinx myself or you, but that's part of that storyline. So we might have a list of activities to tick off. We might have people with whom we wanted to reconcile, places or things that we wanted to see just one last time. The announcement of a serious diagnosis is a solemn moment when directions shift, priorities change, and life appears in sharper focus, right? In the sense that the diagnostic utterance shines a new and different life on our lives and our identities, we might say that it exercises power. Let's just stop and think for a moment. Whatever it was we had in our body, we had it a long time before that diagnostic moment. Those signs and symptoms of the presence of the illness were things that made us organize ourselves and say we need to see the doctor. The moment at which the doctor utters the diagnosis is just a moment of linguistic transfer, or it's a moment of speaking. And yet, it does a lot to us, or we can imagine it doing a lot to us as we receive that message. It brings awareness of our bodies forward in our minds and our consciousness, Rather than being the tools by which we explore our world and reach out for our fulfillment, the sick body complains, creaks, disobeys our intentions, and even though we might be feeling relatively well at the point we get the diagnostic utterance, we're anticipating what's yet to come. The name imposes, and I've stolen this from a woman named Suzanne Fleischmann, who's a linguist, who's written a beautiful paper on the language of the diagnostic disclosure. And I have not put references on these slides, but a reference list is available to you by email afterwards. So if you'd like the references, please let me know. That was a long parenthesis. But what Suzanne Fleischmann has said is that the name of a diagnosis, a serious one, imposes an indelible boundary on life. And this diagnostic moment ends up dividing life into before and after, a division henceforth superimposed onto every rewrite of the individual's life story. Her own life was thus cleaved, and it was after the reception of a serious diagnosis herself that she pondered the linguistic consequences or the linguistic tools available for talking about diagnosis and how they shaped that experience. So the moment a diagnosis is named, even if that moment isn't quite as circumscribed as the one I'm talking about here, it's a moment in which a story gets told. It's a story we're able to imagine even if we haven't experienced it or witnessed it before, because it's such a common trope. It's such a common device. It's everywhere. We've seen it in so many places that we're not even aware of when we've seen it. And in this room, I imagine there are very few of us who've ever been in that context before. We're able to imagine it nonetheless. Now, actually, we could stop and ponder the fact that the diagnosis is in and of itself a narrative. If a narrative is linking together a phenomenon, usually in a linear manner, but not always, if it's generating an explanation, if it has a plot line, if it has a denouement in which a knotted bundle of threads gets untied or untangled, that's in fact a bit what a diagnosis is. It is the assembly of a phenomenon to provide an explanation, a plot line. The plot line from the diagnosis, of course, is quite closely linked with prognosis, what's going to happen next, with treatment, what actions need to be taken, and with character construction, who's going to be involved in this game. So one of the things I said earlier, diagnosis is a trope or a motif, and what I have found in my ongoing research is that the stories of diagnosis are told in a particular tone with an expectation of a particular kind of outcome. I'm going to go over many of these as we move forward. And that's probably why we can imagine that diagnosis scene so vividly. We've seen it before in many other guises. We've seen a somber newspaper report, for example, about a celebrity learning that they've got unexpected cancer or a life-shortening diagnosis. We've read a book in which the protagonist must wrestle with the knowledge of his or her newly found diagnosis. You'll see a film in which the main character watches her life wind down after learning she has early-onset dementia. It's present in many, many different arenas. But well before these stories get told, there are other kinds of stories that must be dealt with. Anytime you go to the doctor, you need to start connecting the dots and organizing the phenomenon or the symptoms into some pattern that suggests a diagnostic story. The discomfort you're feeling or the problem you're experiencing is something for which you require medical advice. It's something that you can relate to as being connected to the kind of work that doctors do. So maybe you go because your better half told you you'd better get that checked out, in which case someone else has created a different story with the symptoms than you might have. She might be worried about what happened to your good friend Tim, how that dull pain in his throat turned out to be angina, how he was saved by a whisker, by his own better half nagging him to go see the doctor. You knew it was just heartburn. You'd had it before after lunch from that particular cafe. It was probably just their vinaigrette. two different stories about why you felt belchy. This connecting of the dots, however you or other people propose to organize the problem, is the beginning of a story. So the story you're going to take to the doctor, when the doctor turns to you and says, what brings you here today, you assemble those events that made you think you should talk with a health professional, and you weave them together so that they'll make sense to her. So for your sore hands, this is why I put up a sore hand slide, you might talk about your mother and how her hands were gnarled with osteoarthritis. You talk about the persistent discomfort in your left pointer finger, your right pinky. You explain that you can't get your wedding ring off anymore because your joints are swollen. As you put these bits together and explain the events, you offer her the building blocks out of which the diagnostic narrative is going to emerge. But there's another story you could tell about those hands and that wedding ring. The same set of events, the same set of problems can be told in another way. And it need not be about diagnosis. For example, that hand pain, even though your mother's hands were gnarled with pain, you only started noticing your hand pain when you got your new mountain bike. The new bike and its delightful responsiveness meant that you were out on it every free minute. You biked to work, you bike home from work, and you biked up in the mountains when you got a free moment after that. You used to be doing 4 rides a week, and now you're doing 8. You've even registered for an upcoming event. So taken are you by your beautiful bike. You might be taking more challenging descents and squeezing those brakes harder. And it's a different brake system than the one you had on your old Anthem. So you're thinking, could be the brakes. If that's the narrative you're telling, you go to your mechanic. But it's the same hands. So just as easily you could attribute the gastric upset to somebody's cooking rather than to a potential disease, like the vinaigrette example above. You could attribute the headache to stress. You could look at the sore joint and say, that's my poor fitness. I should do more core stability. You might even perhaps prefer to overwork. So there are lots of ways of telling a story. But it's not surprising that when you go to the doctor, the first part of the process, when he or she says, what's troubling you today, and you start in your explanation, that's called taking a history. And if you look, there are two interesting points in labeling it taking a history. The first one, of course, is the etymology of the word history, which is from the Greek historia, or narrative. And the second is that listening to a patient's account is called taking. There's a sense of appropriation embedded in that particular action that we all call taking a history, which punctuates the idea that a diagnosis is something which is created through tension and control. Now, if you take your problems to the doctor, chances are you've already made a decision that there's a diagnosis to be had, and you've already started to frame your story in that sense. However, the process of storytelling at that level enacts, probably in the most obvious of ways, the transformative trope. By seeking the diagnostic explanation, you're having to give them away. You're having to give the story away to have it transformed into something medical. We have to expose our stories, listen to their not necessarily to our liking retelling in order to get a diagnosis. But this moment of exchange is not as simple as you tell and your doctor retells. Not everyone is a good story, and not every patient knows the conventions of the diagnostic narrative. They may, for example, expect the body to be able to provide much more information than language, and leave the clinician to construct a story without enough help. They may not have the precision in their vocabulary to explain how they feel or the nature and intensity of their pain. They may resort to Likert scales, and I think we've discussed it in other meetings this week. The intellectuals amongst us often find it very difficult to say my pain rates X on a scale of 0 to 10. We break it into subsections and decimals and end up not knowing how to answer. But in the clinic, you have people saying, doctor, it's a 5. Doctor, it's an 8. The ectopic pregnancy to whom I referred over lunch said, it's a 3. So you see, I don't find it to be a very useful way, but it is another way of telling a story. When a patient can't tell their story or can't express their concerns effectively, the doctor listener may need to coax the story along, wrangling it up and heading it along the path, hoping all the while that they've got the right elements gathered up in the right paddock. It's not always that easy. And sometimes they're mistakes, and sometimes the mistakes are not out of poor intent, but simply that the information and the storytelling vantage points from which the layperson and the physician recount their stories are incompatible enough that there's a mismatch and the wrong story gets told. In the ideal rendition of the narrative exchange, the story one brings to the doctor for diagnostic purposes gets heard, processed, rearranged, and retold. Some of the, and I'm sure in this room many of you are aware of the people who've dealt with or discussed the issues around retelling of stories. Prevalent described this in 1964. His work was mainly in psychiatry, as you'll probably be aware, but he talked about this exchange as a negotiation where the patient and doctor reflect upon the telling and retelling of the particular narrative, and they together shape a new story until it takes a form that both of them can live with. Leader describes the diagnostic process as one which is interpretive. It's an endeavor in which the diagnostician takes the narrative and completes it with technological, experiential, and physical texts to develop a diagnostic explanation, hermeneutic. He cautions medicine against losing the patient narrative, the patient's representation of illness, from sight, because he feels that therapeutic actions or therapeutic objectives can never be achieved if the interpretation is at odds with the story the patient has brought. And of course, I believe many of you had the opportunity to meet Art Frank a year ago or so when he was here on campus. He talks about the offering of the narrative by the person seeking a medical care as a narrative surrender. It's a point, he writes, at which medicine wrests control away from the individual, transforms a story of dysfunction into a medical one. The language changes, the explanatory framework changes, and diagnosis replaces the symptoms in the framing of illness. So whereas it might have been a symptom-framed narrative, it becomes a diagnostically framed one upon the completion of the medical consultation. So Frank, Leader, and many others have pointed to this issue of transferring a patient narrative to the medical retelling, the taking of the personal history, and have described it as salient and oft-times problematic. As Frank has explained, more is involved in the illness experience than the medical story can tell. He argues that for most people there's a need to go beyond the medical narrative to recover their own voice, and in this current era of illness narratives we can see that there is certainly a will for that. Fear of having a narrative usurped by the medicalized version may push patients to try to control the diagnostic process. And when we think about the alarm, the moral panic around self-diagnosis, we also can think that much of this is about trying to have a modicum of control in a place where diagnosis is indeed under the authority of one particular individual, or one class of individual. So patients may not want to relinquish their studies, or they may relinquish them so completely formed as to kind of create a resistant interference to the medicalization of their stories. So the narrative that a doctor tells about diagnosis is always at the same time the story of a patient, but it's also the story of other patients which have gone before. It's also the story of what a doctor sees his or her role as being. and it's also the story of life and death and disease. So it's never a simple story of just your appendicitis or just your unmentionable dire diagnosis. So the story that the doctor we saw in that first picture was telling his traumatized patient was nestled in as one among many other stories that in which the doctor had previously participated or which the doctor had previously narrated. He had prepared the story he was going to deliver to his patient along with the diagnosis. He chose his plot carefully, trying to decide whether to cast this diagnosis as an opportunity, a lucky break, or seriously bad news. He set the frames that shaped the story. He described the potential plot twists. He enumerated the characters. He chose his metaphors. He really did a good job of telling a story, even if he didn't tell it well. Nonetheless, he had to narrate this. And he narrated it on the basis of diagnostic templates, of professional templates, of the collation of many other stories he'd told in the past and the different outcomes he'd seen. But he also, at the same time, had a story to tell himself about himself and the work he does, what his role is, what he should be offering, what he shouldn't be. He might have thought to link the characters, which in this case were the patient and himself, with other characters he'd seen in the past, and that's, as I was saying, to anticipate perhaps the pitfalls and the side stories and the stories of hope. He might rely upon flashbacks from which he'll need to return. He needs to make sure that as he talks to the patient, he isn't only telling the stories of others, but he's thinking about the context of that patient and what that patient's story was. The story of his work would mingle with the story of the disease, its histories, its legends, its fictions. Who's read The Emperor of All Melodies? Yeah? Yeah. Read it. It's an interesting example of doctor narrative. It's a doctor narrative about what it is to be a doctor, about what it is to be Siddhartha Mukherjee, about what cancer is, what kind of a character cancer is. It also has the interwoven narratives of, in particular, three patients who he follows, three patients who survive or are surviving at the time the book goes to press. So it's a very intricate interweaving of many stories, and there are lots of those books. There are lots of those doctor books which cast the doctor in a particular light, usually a heroic one, and that's not bad, because if you don't believe in what you're doing, you should be doing something else. They're often about the terrible foe. In Siddhartha Mukherjee's case, it's the cancer, but in other cases, it's something else. Henry Marsh, it's the brain and its foibles. Atul Gawande, it's aging and death. They just keep going. Lisa Sanders is a huge accumulation of different stories that patients bring. But how he sets up the story of heroism, a story of sneaky jester who's going to be able to trick the disease in order to rescue the patient, or it might be a story of despair where the disease is an ever-present enemy ready to strike despite his best efforts. In any case, his story is very important, and it's one that's going to leave an imprint on the patient, the family, the entourage. It's an outline which will be difficult to erase or reimagine. So the moment at which the doctor sets his or her narrative forward, there's a very strong input. As one late 19th century doctor wrote, doctors' words count double. And indeed, that's part of the power of the medical narrative. So the medical narrative often creates often inflexibly a template which is enduring and determinate. It casts a permanent shape on the interaction, the condition, the individuals. It is dominant. So again, the power of the diagnostic narrative. But it also tells a story about the profession, its ascendancy, its place in the systems that define health and disease, and which determine what we do about them. The fact that medicine holds the rein in defining what counts as health healthy or sick means that it has the capacity, or I probably should say the power, to define normality, which is an incredible sense of control. I took that picture at the Musée pour l'Histoire de Médecine in Paris, and it's beautiful. Now, going back to doctor stories, I talked about them a moment ago. Here's the list, or here is a list, along with the illness narrative, and sometimes in combination with, if we will look at the Paul Calinte book, which I didn't, yes, I did, the third one, When Breath Becomes Air, and Sachs, although I don't think that one is autobiographical. The doctor narrative is a powerful way of staking out the importance of diagnosis. Lisa Sanders' book is a nice starting point. The purpose of her book is to highlight diagnosis. It's what she calls a crucial linchpin of medicine. By framing it as crucial, she's underlining one more time, in case we needed to be reminded, how pivotal diagnosis is. It's critical, indispensable, truly the pivot upon which everything else is exquisitely balanced. She confers upon diagnosis in casting it thus an immense part in the drama of illness. And I might add, and I'm not sure if I'm going to say it again, so I may end up repeating myself. I'm kind of doing a ready presentation. I don't usually read them quite as much. But Lisa Sanders also does a wonderful column in the New York Times called Diagnosis. And the story of Lisa Sanders, who's a professor of general practice at Yale, is that before she became a doctor, she worked in media and communication. And I think maybe as a first or second year resident, or registrar, you call them registrars here, or residents? Registrars, like in New Zealand. Somehow or another, she got approached by the New York Times to write this column on diagnosis, and every month there's a new and weird diagnosis for the readers to try to sort out. And this column is called Thinking Like a Doctor. And on the one hand, it's very powerful for two reasons. One, I think, saying thinking like a doctor is almost like saying you can look in your teacher's grade book. It's like having access to a certain kind of power that you normally don't get to play with. And normal people who don't have medical educations can say, ah, it's X or it's Y. And it's not always the medical people who correctly diagnose these unusual cases that she puts forward in the New York Times. But the other thing is that this, because it was so full of curious and difficult to diagnose conditions, it attracted the attention of the producers of the show that was to be Dr. House, MD. So Dr. House, MD actually is the result or emerges from this column which offered people the ability to think like a doctor. And now you have the super duper diagnostic specialist on TV, of course, who tells it to us in popular culture. And that's also an interesting thing. But back to Lisa's book, in addition to the, oh, thank you so much. In addition to its mechanisms of power, the last statement I said was that everything pivots on diagnosis. Diagnosis itself is, for Lisa Sanders, a story. It's the same story that we've just discussed before, which links clues and signs and pulls them together, fitting things together so they make sense for the doctor and for the patient. But she also says, and I found that really interesting, the diagnostic story is its own reward. Doctors take pleasure, she writes, in recounting the completed story of their complex diagnoses. So again, it's confirming the profession. It's the stories that doctors tell amongst themselves. And Mark, I told you my diagnosis at lunch. So we have these diagnostic stories to tell. You did the same thing. So the idea not only that we pull the symptoms together and diagnose them and say, aha, we have narrated these symptoms and put a plot line around them, but we go back. And I'm sure you told me your memorable story of diagnosis as a registrar. I told you my memorable non-diagnosis as a paramedic nurse in rural New Zealand without any support. So diagnostic stories are very important, and they confirm who we are, those of us who need to do that kind of work. Very important. So Sanders, like I think all of the authors that I've put here for you to look at, celebrates diagnosis. So her story is that diagnosis represents a better understanding of illness, and it leads to better therapies, better care, better outcomes. It's also an art which depends on a curious, stubborn, critical doctor detective, being able to put the pieces together in logical narrative sequence. The clues would always be in the story, in the patient's story as well as the doctor's story. So in so doing and constructing it in this way, she's still ever extolling the diagnosis and revealing its importance. These other books undertake a similar task. I already spoke to you about The Emperor of All Maladies. When Breath Becomes Air. Have you read this? This is Paul Calinthy, who's actually himself a respiratory physician. I think he's a consultant when he discovers that he has a lung cancer which will become terminal. That book, if you forgive the expression, has gotten a lot of air. And one of the things about these doctor-written memoirs is that because of medicine's authority, based in great part upon its ability to diagnose, these medical writers seem to catch our attention in a way that the simple lay writer would not be able to do. So even Art Frank, who in academe is regarded as one of the most clever writers both of the illness narrative and the analysis of the illness narrative, who wrote At the Will of the Body in 1995, I think. He's world famous amongst us for that book, which was a crossover book, not unlike Calinthy's book, but I'm sure that Calinthy's book has sold 100 times more. So when we think about why these books have purchase, we also have to think about the social authority of their authors, and that in and of itself is interesting. Atul Gawande is certainly a celebrant of diagnosis, or a celebrator of diagnosis, as is Henry Marsh and Oliver Sacks. What William Boyd wrote in The Guardian about the multiplication of doctor-authored stories about diagnosis, he was referring in particular to surgeon. I hope he'll forgive me for taking the liberty of thinking he's talking about doctors in general. He says they pit their talent, their gifts, their knowledge, skill, and experience against something malign, elusive, and finally uncontrollable: disease and injury. They report their victories, of course, but in so doing, they punctuate the power of diagnosis. Well, also the power of disease as well, but there's a distinction to make. It's a bit lengthy to make that distinction, but I might just very briefly. And we'll start with the Mukherjee, Emperor of All Maladies, and cancer. So cancer is a diagnosis. How many cancers are there? I don't know, so many we can't even count them. Oh yeah, well, how many breast cancers are there? Oh yeah, so many we can't really count them. Diagnosis is the language, the word, the way we group things together in order to understand them. But it is not the disease itself. So for you to have a fear of cancer would be a little bit silly, because cancer is such a non-specific term that it means nothing. And yet it does. Symbolically, it means lots in our popular imaginary. If you were a pathologist, you would evaluate the cell type, you would evaluate the spread, you would look at so many things before even a specific cancer type could be given any meaning. So these are the words that we affix to the diseases. And I'm not pretending that people do not suffer and that we do not have dysfunction in our bodies, but the way we pull together our dysfunctions and decide how to label them is a very social activity. So, for example, things like gout, which is a very material, physical, painful disease, is made up of all sorts of things, like renal filtration, like uric acid production, like dietary intake, like joint pain. The fact that we put it all together in a particular package and said, this is gout, and rheumatologists will take care of it, is a social action. So as Siddhartha Mukherjee talks about cancer, he's actually talking about many, many, many diseases, right? And when he talks about the power of diagnosis, he's talking about those words, not the diseases. The words capture some physical things underneath, but we mustn't mistake the one for the other. Now, this is the fun part. He's naked. That's not why it's fun, though. We've talked about how diagnosis is one kind of narrative, connecting symptoms into a plausible explanation with a beginning, a middle, and maybe an end. We've looked at how diagnosis is expressed as a narrative and stimulates narrative, as in the medical memoirs. But diagnosis is also contained in narrative. This is the fun part of the presentation. It figures prominently in film and fiction and television and other forms of popular culture. It exercises power there as well. In fiction, diagnosis is almost always an impetus for transformation, a mechanism via which the characters can reveal themselves. It's a launching pad for reactions, responses, and actions. Diagnosis in fiction is never accidental. It serves a fundamental purpose when it surfaces. It's not there by mistake. The way it works in fiction is not necessarily a reflection of the way it works in real life. It's a creation and a representation, albeit a frequent one. And this one, does anyone know what this is? Nope. Yep. Yeah, of course. It's the Avengers. Now, why did I stumble across the Avengers? Was I busy watching the Avengers one day? No. This was New Year's Eve last year, and we were out in the country, and there were, I don't know, 20 people in the house, and the adults were boring. So I went into the lounge where we'd corralled the children, and they were watching the Avengers, superhero stuff. Just when I came in, and I say just when I came in, this scene was playing. You ready? 100? Yeah, great.
Yeah, hurt anybody? There's nobody around here to get hurt. Did scare the hell out of some pigeons, though. Lucky. Or just a good aim. You were awake when you fell. So, the whole thing, right through the ceiling, big and green and buck-ass nude. Yeah. Didn't think those would fit you until you shrunk down to a regular sized belly. You an alien? What? From outer space, an alien? No. Well then, some
Okay, so you know what's going on there, right? He's deviant. Something's wrong with him, and it's bad. He turns big and green and buck-ass nude, but he's not an alien. The two things this Harry Dean Stanton, who just died last week, rest his soul. He was a great actor, and he, I think, acted in his last, according to the media, his last movie this year at age 91. But you have a man who is clearly acting outside of the range of normality. So he's got to either be an alien or he's sick. But if you read the producer's discussion of this particular scene, which was, I think, much longer originally, it was also about helping Hulk or Banner accept himself as he was. There's a certain legitimization which a diagnostic narrative allows. He's got access to the sick role. He's entitled to be deviant, and that's kind of cool. So what that did make me think, though, occurred to me, is that even from, if little children, because these were little children that were watching this, we were socializing them to the idea that diagnosis is one way of understanding, in this case, supernatural strength. But possibly that's a narrative which helps us to understand other forms of deviance being labeled as diseases. I can't remember what the next one is. Down 85. We're just turning down the volume. Okay. This one you're probably going to... Oh! That's not right. There we go.
Mr. White. Mr. White?
Yes.
You understood what I just said to you?
Yes.
Okay, sir. No problem. I'm sorry. I just need to make sure you fully understand. Best case scenario with chemo, I'll live maybe another couple of years. It's just, you got mustard on your, I did you, mustard there, right there.
You know where that comes from? Does anyone not know?
Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad. So what's interesting in that scene, well, and in the whole, this is early first episode, right? And what we know about Walter White, who's the guy who saw the mustard, is that he's a henpecked, repressed chemistry teacher in high school with nasty students who don't care about what he's doing, and he's miserable. Now, the cancer diagnosis either transforms him from ordinary guy around town in a oppressed situation, or reveals him for what he is. But it is via the diagnosis that the whole narrative takes place. Now I kind of see him trying to hang on to who he is, looking at a mustard spot. That's ordinary banality of everyday life, when in fact he's about to become a meth maker, dealer, killer, nepotist, horrifying bad guy. How do you go from there to there? In this case, by the transformative power of the diagnosis. Another one? Videos are fun, aren't they? Back up to 100. I like videos, but I don't quite have the skill to get them all at the same volume ahead of time. Here we go. This is beautiful. Oh, sorry, I did it wrong again. Particular apologies to those who are watching online. Here we go.
Is there something you should know?
I think we should run the test first.
Tell me, think you can answer. That's okay. I know each other a long time.
Now, based on the examination that we just and the complaints you described to me, it's my opinion that you are experiencing the early symptoms of Parkinson's.
From this, from just living without that.
Yes, I'm afraid I can. But we just still run the blood test and have the MRI just to rule out any more adverse possibilities.
Wow.
Do you recognize that scene, anyone? It's from a film called Late Quartet. It's a fabulous movie. Yeah, I think it may have had another name. It may, I have a feeling it had two names. It might have just been Quartet as well, but it was called The Late Quartet where I saw it. And in that scene, this is the lead cellist in a very famous quartet. Around him, he has three neurotic two violinists and a neurotic they're all not neurotic, and he's going to have to exit. So of course it's a change in his life, but the transformation takes place at the level of the other characters. So the presence of the diagnosis is a catalyst to create change in these other members of the group. It's a very powerful example of how the diagnosis throws everyone into disarray. He's the senior member of the group. He's the glue that holds them together, and as he steps out, it all crumbles. But you might see that as well in other films. You've seen Still Alice, perhaps? And Still Alice, if you see it again, you might have thought it was about Alice, and certainly I did the first time I saw it. It's amazing how many times they take 50-something academic females and put them through Alzheimer's disease. I find that stressful. But if you look at that film critically, it's not so much about Alice as it is about the characters reorganizing around her. They still her as she remains herself, but her wayward daughter becomes gains redemption. Her husband, who starts with this wonderful caring, he leaves her for a job in academia. So frequently the diagnosis is not about the main character, but about what's happening around. In any case, it remains transformative. So as I promised I would in the beginning of this presentation, I'm revealing these diagnostic narratives in order to illustrate their power, with the hopes that by seeing them we can think about what happens in their presence and what other actions are actually implicitly taking place without us maybe paying heed. Now this is the slide I've been trying to show you now for at least 4 slides. This is just a small collection of diagnosis books. I can start with Ian McEwan, Saturday, which many of you have probably read, and I'll just tell you how I got that book. I wrote my first academic book, putting a name to it, and I thought it would be good to have an epigraph with the word diagnosis in it, and I went into some medical humanities database and put diagnosis, and this came up. And so that was, but there weren't many that came up. This one did come up. This is a story of a neurosurgeon. He's standing on his balcony, or that's representation there, on a Saturday morning early. He's gotten up early and he's going to go to market, and there's some protest going on, and there's traffic backed up, and he's not paying attention, and he rams into the back of the car in front of him, and out of that car comes a gang of thugs, and they're pretty upset, and he can see that they're getting ready to, do him some harm. And yet he's a neurosurgeon, and he's looking at the gang leader, and he can see Huntington disease syndrome symptoms. And he stops and he says, "Your dad had it, now you've got it too. What have they told you?" Immediately the gang leader is disarmed. So that diagnostic moment, that sidewalk diagnosis, I think he calls it himself a shaman. He said, "You don't defy the shaman," and he backs off. He takes his thugs, puts them in the car, orders them off, and leaves them alone. It's not the end of the story, clearly, but it's yet again an example of the diagnostic power. I'm part of a, we call it the critical diagnosis group, a multidisciplinary group of people across my university who study diagnosis from critical, cultural, other ways than clinical. And there was a woman from the English department who was very interested in diagnosis, and she was going to, with me, do some work on diagnosis and fiction. And I said, "Anna, how do you find stuff on how do you do it? Like, I know how to use PubMed, I know how to locate articles that way. How do you find fiction with a particular theme?" She said, "Oh, you just talk to people. You just talk to people, ask them, tell them what you're doing, get excited, they'll tell you." I said, "Oh, okay." I didn't have to talk to anyone. They kept coming to me like magnets. I told you about the book on the rubbish heap near my sister's house. I told you about the book on Susan Kelly's dresser. I told you about the book in the airport. They were just everywhere. So I'm going to go through a few of them and tell you where I found them and what the diagnosis is. The Tiger's Wife, that was on my colleague's dresser, is a marvelous story about a supernatural, magical diagnostic. The protagonist, who pits himself against medicine, is the cousin of death. and he has been condemned to go tell people their diagnosis. And these are only the diagnoses which have immediate death following them. Ian Banks' Complicity, I can't tell you where the diagnosis is because you haven't read it yet, and it's in the end, and I'm not going to say. But this is just a book I picked up off the shelves in my, in the cottage down south. It's a mystery book. There's a bad guy. He kills a lot of people. And there's a serious diagnosis, which changes the whole narrative in a chilling way. Anna Funder, we were discussing this one at lunch, All That I Am. The diagnosis is on page 8. And it's a lady, her name is Dr. Becker. She's being told that she has Alzheimer's disease and she's going to lose her memory. And she says, I'm sorry, doctor, I'm not losing my memory, I'm remembering more. So the diagnosis was a means which enabled her to go back into her past and tell the fictional, it's a memoir, a fictional memoir of a wartime Jewish resistant who was killed by the SS and whose death was concealed. And for the first time, she's allowed to let that story resurface because her Alzheimer's disease gives her permission to mix the past and the present. Michael Morpurgo, Alone on a Wide, Wide Sea. Not sure I pronounced his name right. He's an Australian author for young adults. This is a story I picked up at my granddaughter's house. I was trying to read in the short time I was with her every book she had on her shelf. And it starts with, they say in order to write a story, you either have to know the beginning or the end. I don't know the beginning, but I do know the end. And you think to yourself, what's this is going to be about? Well, of course, he has a brain tumor. So he has to quickly get down the story to try to find the beginning. And of course, his story is the story of, he was a little British wartime orphan who was sent away to Australia. And he thinks he remembers his sister saying goodbye. He thinks he was separated from a big sister named Kitty, but he can't quite remember because he was so little. And so here he is getting ready to die. He's going to see if he had a sister, Kitty. And that's the trigger for the story, the brain tumor. Gilead is also epistolary novel written by an old man who has angina pectoris. He says it has a certain, it sounds like misericordia, has a certain theological quality, he says, as he also, in the presence of his diagnosis, writes letters to his very young child who he knows he won't live to see grow up. Vital Signs by Tessa McWatt, I loved, although it hasn't been so well reviewed. It's a man whose wife has all of a sudden started talking jumblish, and she has a brain disorder, I can't remember what it is now, but which is diagnosed in about the 2nd chapter. And he knows that as she goes on, she will understand him less and less. And he wants to come clean about infidelities, but she's no longer able to understand. And in fact, he loves her, and is never able to come clean because of her diagnosis. All-Star Superman. Who saw that or read that? Page 7. He has cellular apoptosis as a result of stellar radiation incurred when saving the world from Lex Luthor. Wednesday, the Rabbi Got Wet. These are fabulous little books. They were written in the 1970s, early 70s. I don't know if there are any Jewish people in the room. I'm one. I don't know that much about Judaism, but I know a lot more since I read the Rabbi series. He had one for Monday, one for Tuesday, all the way through to Sunday. And each day he's busy helping an Irish-American police officer solve mysteries using techniques of Talmudic reasoning. But the purpose of the books was, I think, it was some cross-cultural, get the wider public interested in what Jewish people do. But there's this wonderful conversation in the background. This is not about diagnosis. The book is not about diagnosis at all, other than there's a lady who dies from taking penicillin when she has a known penicillin allergy. Did the doctor prescribe it wrong, or did the chemists fill it wrong? We don't know. But there's a little conversation between doctors talking about the doctor who filled the prescription, saying he's a funny bird. He's a funny bird. He's way too nice. He would not be definitive and strong in delivering a diagnosis, they said. This makes him at odds with what the medical fraternity would expect of a diagnostician, and that casts him under a dubious light. No, he did not make the mistake. And the final one, Susan Hill, The Various Haunts of Men, this is simply, there's a diagnosis in it, but even more interestingly, the they're in the book, the main detective is a triplet. And his sister, there's of course a triplet off in Australia. People always go off to Australia, and I don't know what role he plays. But his sister is a doctor. And together they solve these mysteries. And there is a diagnostic twist in it. A woman with breast cancer who's going to go to the evil naturopath who's killing people and pretend she wants care in order to capture him. So the diagnosis is used again in a powerful way. But what I like here as well is the parallel between the medical triplet and the detective triplet. Both of them are dealing with life and with death, with truth and with lies, and diagnosis is the currency with which the sister doctor is working. Of course, we have these as well. You know House, I don't need to talk to you about it. Do you remember the scene in Mad Men? Betty, do you remember? Some of you've watched Mad Men. It's a 1960s set chronicle of marketing men in the 1960s, and there's a 1960s housewife married to one of the marketing men who's going to have breast cancer, and the diagnosis scene is a powerful scene in which Betty is seen in profile a little bit like Walter White in that stunned sort of context, and people are talking in the background. She's being talked about. She's not being talked to. And the role of diagnosis is, in this particular case, is to punctuate the scene quite clearly as one of melodrama, with the unachievable or the impossibility of being female in this world. Angels in America has an HIV diagnosis scene. Has anyone seen that? Yeah, and of course he rejects the diagnosis not because he doesn't believe he doesn't have the disease, but because only gay people can have it, and he's not gay. Yes, he has sex with men, but to be gay is to be weak. I'm not weak. I'm not a faggot, he says. I'm not weak. Look at me. I have, he says, contact or a direct line to the strongest person in the United States. Do you know who that is? Is it the president? No, it's the president's wife, he says. But interestingly as well, when he's finally hospitalized in end stages, he's hospitalized with liver cancer. So the power of the name, of course, and during the HIV era, in its early days was incredible. I worked at the National Institutes of Health in the late 1980s, so that was in the early days of the public and clinical awareness of HIV. And when I first got there, there was a very famous French comedian who had recently died of stomach cancer in the US in experimental treatment. Oh, no, wrong. He died of AIDS, I found out, because I worked in his service. And the number of manufactured diagnoses that were provided publicly, not only for HIV, I can remember actually a famous congressman died in my arms one night of his, as I was turning him to do his cares. He had prostate cancer, and as I left the hospital that morning and was listening to the news, I heard of his passing of bone cancer, because prostate cancer was another diagnosis, curiously to me, this was 1989, that couldn't be spoken of, or that at least his family had decided couldn't be spoken of. Now, this is the House diagnosis debate around the diagnosis board. It's an important configuration of characters. The narrative construct or the representation of the diagnosis discussion is quite poignant, and you'll see why when I get to the next scene. You ready? This is the murder board. So this is on Castle, where we've got the New York Police Department looking, I think perhaps more traditionally, at a board on which all these things are posted and depicted in order to try to establish the narrative of the murder. But what this is doing is it's casting House, that representation in House in that same format, is a kind of rigid and yet reassuring certainty of right and of wrong, paralleling it with law and order gives us a sense of control over a diagnosis which otherwise might be too baffling. So the power of diagnosis in the house is the power to impose boundaries and authoritative relationships, just as these police officers do. House structures relationships and even reality when he pronounces his diagnoses. Okay, we're getting towards the end. That's a space holder. What we have to think about now, well, it could be a patient or it could be the doctor, I haven't decided. But the thing that I'd like to prod you to think about in relation to these powerful diagnostic narratives is how these representations shape our expectations of the diagnosticians we're working with to help us make sense of our dysfunctions. So even just thinking about yourself, most of you have been to the doctor before. Do these representations in any way shape what you think a doctor should be? From the deathless man in The Tiger's Wife to House and Still Alice, we have, oh, and Late Quartet, that's the doctor we'd like to see, isn't it? That lovely older woman. I actually, when I first started doing that, I thought she's clearly Jewish and she's clearly old enough to have survived the war, so there's a picture, there's something about her suffering which with which we're supposed to identify. Actually, no, she's Indian, so that wasn't the story at all. But you still see her as an older person who has lived, who's probably suffered, who can understand your plight, who you can kind of wink with the way the Christopher Whedon character did. You know, you're comfortable. But there's still an array of other models to draw from when we see these representations of diagnosis and its power. So the doctor is demon if we look at the tiger's wife, the cousin of death, the nephew of death. The doctor is detective, the doctor is adversary. And then, of course, the marvelous caring doctor, our friend, like in Late Quartet or in the various Haunts of Man. She's a very caring doctor. Whether we imagine doctors as detectives who will be able to sort out the wheat from the chaff and uncover the truth of our suffering, or as condescending power mongers, like the antagonist in, say, Wit, which you may have seen as well. It's the stories that circulate about doctors that will help elucidate ways in which people anticipate what they'll achieve by consulting a doctor, and from what departure point they'll start to tell their own tales of illness or of health. And the same holds true for clinicians. What stories do they tell themselves about what they are and what they should be? Should they be detectives? Is diagnosis just a clue away? Or do they see disease as a never-tiring foe whose force is indubitable? It's important to see structures which go well above just a simple concept of communication. And I don't, you know, as I realize we don't have many clinicians in the room, but often they'll see the psychosocial side of things as being the story that this patient tells or that patient tells, as opposed to the broader stories that we tell in society and that we're able to recognize in these representations. We're always looking at a story which emerges from a tradition of stories. It's never just a story on its own. But sometimes stories, like Common Sense, are based on assumptions which clearly need crucial, critical reconsideration and which can be retold together. And I don't know if you, like me, have returned to a book that you read and loved as a child. Sometimes when you look at them with distance, you can see new and sometimes moralistic messages that weren't apparent to you when you read them the first time. I just finished reading, you know, trying to keep up with my grandchildren again, Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time. What to me was a really, did you read that? No? Yeah? How many have read that? Yeah. So for me, it was a wonderful science fiction love story when I was a kid. You know, you all felt, or I fell in love with that big tall boy who looked after her and wiped off her glasses. But when I read it today, it's not a science fiction adventure. It's a plea to young adults to accept themselves as they are, and not necessarily in the image of their peers. It's to see love, loyalty, and justice as the important values which will serve them throughout their life. So it's a different story than it was. Reviewing House or Grey's Anatomy, which is one of the least subtle of the diagnosis stories, with a bit of distance reveals different stories than the initial viewing might have. That diagnostic authority instills the diagnostician with power. That diagnosis is a device of characterization. That diagnosis is cast as forensic in nature. We might not have thought about these options as we snort in disbelief when one of the members of House's retinue proposes yet again, it could be sarcoidosis. It seems like every time the team is stumped, they suggest either lupus or sarcoidosis, both rather non-specific systemic autoimmune disorders. But at the same time, if we were watching the show from the personal perspective of someone who has a diagnosis of lupus or sarcoidosis, we might not snort but turn away in despair. Why is a disease by which we are affected so regularly used as a kind of symbolic wastebasket diagnosis that looks like everything and at the same time like nothing? Does it mean that people by extension snort with disbelief when we give them the diagnostic explanation for our illness? Sarcoidosis, you got to be kidding, like on House, you know? So, and I'll just finish with this quote from H. Porter Abbott. It comes from his Cambridge Introduction to Narrative. Narrative often is an instrument that provokes active thinking and helps us work through problems, even as we tell about them or hear them being told. But it is also important to note that narrative can be used to deliver false information. It can be used to keep us in darkness and even encourage us to do things we should not do. This too must be kept in mind. Thank you.
Anne-Marie, I'm so old that when we were struggling with the diagnosis, we said syphilis. Not sarcoidosis. That was the great mimic.
Yeah.
Yep. That's not a story. We have time for questions, and I will let Anne-Marie curate that, if you like, so that you can choose where you go or what you do. So this is a pretty open discussion that we can have now. If anybody online would like to ask a question, put your hand up or do whatever, and Kerry will transfer it. So, should we start?
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I have a question about the absence of diagnostic.
Yes, the non-diagnosis.
The non-diagnostic.
Yes. Yes, I'd love to, because that's what I'm working on now. Thank you. So Tia has asked, I'm not sure, I'll just repeat it in case the online attendees can't hear, but Tia has asked about the absence of diagnosis and its narrative construction, right? What do we, well,
I had the laryngeal collapse, which means I get suffocated, and I went to the doctors and they said, oh, it's either gastric reflux or asthma. And I rejected both, and later they were rejected on, clinical basis.
Yes.
I knew I don't have them. And they said, yeah, we don't know what it was. And this idea of not having the diagnosis was from an episode that
there are many people, so I think, so you're talking about two things at the same time, and I think I can deal with both of them. Yes. One is, and I'll just repeat it again so that the people in the webinar can hear, she has mentioned the fact that she was given a misdiagnosis, perhaps, for something, or you think was probably a misdiagnosis, but I think we can still talk about how, or in the end, they haven't officially given you a diagnosis. And in fact, that is the topic, but not very frequently, the topic of representations. And one of the things that we're trying to understand is if you don't have, in a society where diagnosis is used so frequently as a trope, is so dominant in the discussion of health and illness, what do you do when you have something that doesn't have a name? And I think that many people will be aware, particularly from the group here, that diagnoses like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue are a great source of distress, both for the people who experience them and for the doctors who feel incapable of diagnosing anything. But there are some popular representations of this, and these are fascinating. We haven't, I'm with my husband, Thierry Jutel, who is a film studies scholar, we've been starting to collect examples of contested diagnoses and non-diagnoses. Safe is a film that you may be familiar with Julianne Moore, and this is again a very successful woman who, excuse me, in her wealthy bourgeois neighborhood who has a seizure. She's been getting tired, and no one can explain what's wrong with her. So they're going to attribute it to some psychosomatizing disorder. She's not able to get a diagnosis, and she ends up going off to a camp, a kind of camp which is away from any electromagnetic or chemical sensitizers. But at the same time, she becomes re-exploited by the environment which has welcomed her, because there is a commercial overlay to that. So that's one example. I've been watching Better Call Saul, which has I think an electromagnetic sensitivity character in it, but he's cast as crazy, actually. So in his case, and they try to catch him out. The soul catches him out by putting a telephone in the mailbox, and there's some other things like that. But good question, and we're looking at it, and we don't have a lot there, but here were two examples for you. Yes, Carrie.
Yeah, I would, thank you, by the way, it was really interesting.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I would like to ask about when the medical community or the health profession doesn't consider something as an illness.
Yes.
But it can be. So I'm thinking of, for example, for myself, I had something called hyperemesis Jutel, and I actually advocate for women who do have this illness. And it's actually quite heavily stigmatized in society, because it's perhaps not understood as well as it could be. And I was on the train the other day speaking to a doctor that actually works in A&E and sees women with hyperemesis come in quite frequently, and I said to him, oh, because this illness is, and he looked at me and he went, yeah, but it's not really an illness, is it?
Ah, interesting.
And it's the same with perhaps other sort of things, let's say, for example, PMT, it's considered perhaps normal as a woman to have to go through that, therefore it's not an illness. And it's the same with, I think, hyperemesis gravidarum.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess.
Well, there's some very interesting points that come out of that. We'll go away from narrative a little bit and talk more about sort of sociology of diagnosis in relation to that question. Can I trust that the web people have heard you, or shall I repeat your? Okay, yeah, I thought so. There are a couple of points that I can say in relation to what you said. The first thing is that we have right now a particular reliance upon diagnostic technology as some sort of objective kind of way of knowing that a thing is real, as opposed to psychosomatic or part of normal life. And the diseases for which there isn't a blood test, shall we say, for which there isn't a biological marker, are often held in lower esteem than, which is another reason why psychiatric diagnoses are often thought to be less robust as diagnostic categories than, say, things for which we can witness some physical, blood test, some sort of a marker. But there's not a single diagnosis for which, I may be overstating that, but let me overstate for a moment, if you will. There are very few diseases, even with markers, that are without debate. The parameters of any diagnosis are always blurry and lead to critique. What's interesting, I think, in that particular question is, of course, the issue of gender. That's one problem. If we go and look at that historically, however, there's certainly been a long tradition of teaching women to use medical care and see their bodies as diseased. And there has been a long tradition, so whether it's menstrual disability theory, which emerged in the 20th century. So what's really quite curious is that medical thought was that middle class and upper class women were very fragile, and then when they are good consumers of medical care, then they're accused today of over medicalizing, and that's also a problem. We wish that men would be better consumers of medical care, and that's possibly the result of that historical practice. The other thing, though, and you've used the word illness, and I'll make a sociological distinction between illness and disease, because illness, this is technical, but illness is the term that we might use to describe that we feel bad, that we are suffering. But medicine tends to, is capable of neglecting illness in the absence of what it would like to consider disease. So if we look at some of the contested conditions, such as the ones we discussed earlier, the electromagnetic sensitivities, the fibromyalgias, the unexplained chronic fatigues, medicine hasn't quite yet decided how it wants to understand these, and it doesn't give them disease status, even though they clearly count as illness. For the hyperemesis gravida, is that how we say it? Gravidarum. I am surprised that that's not taken seriously. It certainly is in New Zealand, but that may be because 72% of our births are attended by midwives, and it may be a different way of understanding the, the process of pregnancy. Yeah.
I know that before medicalisation, it was one of the leading causes of death during pregnancy, and Charlotte Bronte died of it as well. So whilst it isn't serious these days, if people are treated correctly, it is serious if not treated. If not treated correctly,
and actually its diagnostic status is part of how treatment, I imagine, is afforded. Because if you say to yourself, I just need some crackers and stay in bed, you might not get what you require in order to survive. Yes.
Other questions?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for some really fascinating paper. I think my question has to do with, you mentioned Tom Kushner's Angels in America.
Yes.
I was thinking of situations, especially around contemporary diagnosis, HIV, that to me situation pose a very open up a conundrum for narrative and representation, and particularly around the state of undetectability that one gets with medication, in the sense that, particularly in terms of film and TV drama that I'm more familiar with, but also in terms of public health campaigns, there seems to be a difficulty of trying to narrate what really it means today to represent what it means today to have an HIV diagnosis. And to me, since it's in film and TV, it goes back to kind of 1980s tropes, because we don't have any contemporary. So yes, it's the issue of undetectability, like having something but not having it.
I see. Yeah. So having an HIV infection but not having AIDS.
So and not developing it. So something that is kind of exists almost as a kind of virtuality, but not an actual.
But not enacted. Yeah.
They can connect and read. So.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm going to say what you've just said, even though I don't really know that I can say add much to what you said. But just for the benefit of the web attendees, and you'll correct me if I'm mistaken in representing what you've just said, most of the representations of HIV and AIDS actually are from the 80s and early 90s. And it's a bit difficult today to find a contemporary representation, particularly in that sort of fluid or ambivalent, or that's not really, I don't know what adjective to use, this state of having something but not having something inside you, almost a latent condition, because having an HIV infection doesn't mean you'll have AIDS. And AIDS perhaps is the juicy bit. It's the juicy bit because that's when it starts being dramatic, and that's when it starts being manifest. And so that's not really present in contemporary representations. Does it feel like an absence to you? Is that the area? Yeah.
And also in the sense that then you end up with the kind of almost situation of mixed messages in public health, which is do this not to get it.
Do this not to get it. Yeah. Okay. So actually, I can think right away of someone whose work might be interesting to read. So again, for the web attendees, the point is that if you have no popular representations, how do public health messages make any sense to those who are supposed to heed them? So if you have no representation of AIDS, why would you take heed of a message that says have safe sex? And I think Martha Stoddard Holmes has written a very nice piece called Pink Ribbons and Something Something. And it's an illness narrative piece of her own, where she talks about ovarian cancer. And for those of you who don't have ovaries, and even for those who do, you may not have an awareness of where they sit. And this is what she wrote about. I didn't know about ovaries, she said, other than in sort of a tinker toy kind of geometric picture. And so when she had funny feeling in her lower body, she couldn't think to relate that to anything that might be ovarian. And in terms of popular representations of ovarian cancer, we have Wit, and that's about it. And Wit is a very interesting, have you guys seen Wit? Worth seeing, really interesting one scene, no, it's not one scene, it's more than one scene, but it was a dramatic, it was a play, and it's about one woman's experience with ovarian cancer, but it's about much more than that. Can't describe it, you'll have to watch it. But anyway, that's the only thing you had available. So no one, she says, and she talks about the absence of the ovaries in popular culture leading to a public health challenge. Because if you don't know where your ovaries are, how can you even associate a particular feeling or discomfort with an ovarian dysfunction? And one of the deep problems with ovarian cancer is it usually only gets detected very late because the ovaries are such deep organs, and by the time they're going to compress something, a bowel or I don't know what, and make you aware of their presence, you're usually at a stage 3, and then it's too bad. It's difficult to cure. Yes, in the back?
Yeah, just on the back of the related disease, and I'm sorry if I'm asking something that wasn't in the beginning of the talk, but there are, this whole discussion reminded me of Robert Granowitz's book titled Risky Medicine,
yep,
where he talks about how diagnosis is made without any kind of disease because it's a risk.
Yep.
It's the diagnosis of risk, and that already spurs action, and there are
yep,
very strong popular representations of his stories that that everybody knows about. Just to mention one, Angelina Jolie, right?
Yes, of course.
And that gives huge audience. And I was wondering if this, they're slowly taking away everything except what you have is a diagnosis without any complaints, any illness, any disease, even any presence of anything wrong.
Yeah.
If you can see that in the change, which Robbie describes as having been happening for a long time, in the past 20 years or so, if that change to this diagnosis of risk, so fiction, and how that, that those narratives, if they make it into this kind of popular.
That's a good question, and just to repeat it for our web attendees, she's making reference to Robbie Aronowitz's book called Risky Medicine, I think. I haven't read it yet. I've just ordered it, though. I'm going to Philadelphia tomorrow. Yes, I'm not sure. We're going to try to catch up. We might not, but I haven't read that yet. And in that book, as you rightly describe, or as you better describe than I would, he's talking about how risk has become the new disease, so that even without the presence of anything, it is the risk which we treat, which we fear. I saw him present on that, and I can't wait to read the book. And how does that exist in popular culture? That I'm not quite so sure, but if we go to sociology of diagnosis, there are two things. One is, of course, I'm sure you've read the Armstrong Surveillance Medicine book piece. No, you have to read that. 1997 or 8, maybe, and I think it's Social Science in Medicine. I'm not sure, but I can give you the references. What he talks about in surveillance medicine is that we're never actually allowed to be healthy. We are always potentially ill. And that's so more than 20 years, a lot longer than that. Now, is that existing yet in popular representation? I'm not sure. That's a very good question, and I'll put my mind to it. But I know as a little girl, I grew up in North America, as did some others in the room, And the idea of a checkup, a yearly checkup, was an important concept. No, we don't seem to have that concept in New Zealand. If you see your doctor regularly, you won't get sick. Like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. That's a little bit different. So keep the doctor away with your apple, but go see your doctor regularly. And we do have lots of other, you know, we treat pre-diabetes, we treat pre-hypertension, we treat, we have previvors of breast cancer, of course. So I think it's a really interesting and important, we are all previving death, of course, and we are all at risk of death.
Okay, so yeah, it was mentioned at the beginning that your work is related to medical praxis, or at least focused towards medical praxis. And at the very end, you asked the question about how the power of these representations and narratives, what that suggests for how we see the nature of doctors and their capacity as diagnosticians. So, and you also said another thing about how the doctor might be a powerful storyteller, but one who's not necessarily accurate, as if there's a distinction to be made, or at least one that you made maybe implicitly, between a powerful speaker, one who speaks narratives well, but also at the same time who can just be plain wrong. But then you say also that it's possible that well, that it's not just narratives altogether, right? So there seems to be a sort of middle ground position between not wanting to say that the doctor always has it right, but at the same time that it's not merely, we're not giving all the legitimacy to power mere discourse or narrative. So I'm wondering if you're in a sort of middle ground between sort of a naive realism and
yeah, and I'm not going to say that. I hope that the web attendees heard all of that, because I don't think I can repeat it. But I didn't mean to talk about the accuracy of the diagnosis.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if I did. Where did you think I said that? And I'll try to.
You mentioned that the doctor might be a powerful storyteller, but one who doesn't get it right at the same time.
Did I say that? Well, it wasn't my intention to focus on that, because in fact, of course, it's correct, just as the doctors might not get it right. So I'm not trying to say that they're infallible, but I wasn't trying to focus on the fallibility. So I may have stumbled there in my speaking. I think what I probably think is most important is the recognition of the configurations of power. And it is not about bad doctors, good patients, or anything like that. It's not about, because I think one of the things I did try to emphasize was that the doctor can only tell the story in the presence of the patient narrative. And yet if the patient is not a good narrator, it often makes for a worse medical story. So there is a co-authorship, which is important to conceptualize, and yet at the same time it is not a equally balanced authorship. So maybe that's what I mean as well. The power to diagnose is in fact a power which is afforded to a particular professional group, and which conveys a great deal of power. The authority to diagnose confers a great deal of power. As you'll well know, you can't miss your lectures with a note from your mom, but you can miss your lectures with a note from your doctor, right? You can't get sick leave with a note from your neighbor, even though she may be best positioned to see how unwell you are. So I can't declare a death, but you, Mark, can, even though I can clearly see if someone's dead. Not acknowledging that relationship and that power, and the other ways in which it exists, like, I mean, that lovely Indian doctor who told the cellist that he had Parkinson's disease. Bum! She just broke up the quartet. It's over. You know, that's the end of that. And yet, well, she probably, because she was carrying the best doctor in the world, probably knew all about his personal life and that she was destroying his quartet, which is why she was hesitant. and slow and gave him some time to think about it. And he was seeing her as someone with great intuitive powers, and that was a power he wanted. He didn't see her as controlling his life, which she wasn't trying to do either. But you can't neglect what the relationship is there. He can't undiagnose himself. He couldn't have access to those tests that she talked about a bit obliquely. He needs her to carry him across that threshold. And at the same time, she destroys his life as he knows it. But that probably didn't answer your question.
It did a bit, yeah.
A little bit?
It was about the relationship between the narratives and practice and stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, maybe I got there a little bit closer. How about you? You have a question?
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really, really interesting. A lot of it focused on like adult diagnosis. I watched a documentary last night from BBC.
Called what, sorry?
I don't remember the name, but it was about children being diagnosed with mental health problems from like really early age. And there was a statistic on that that said, I don't remember the exact number, but it was an alarming number of 2 to 3 year olds on antipsychotic drugs. And I wanted your opinion on constructing narratives for children at that age, with things like ADHD, you know, that's risen in huge numbers. Yeah, so.
Well, so the young lady was asking me, sorry for the benefit of the web people, excuse me, the people who are attending via the web, asking me to comment about the multiplication of psychiatric diagnoses in very young children. And actually you were asking me to do something different, but I'll just stop there. So for thinking about the problem of lots of diagnoses in very young children, it's an alarming problem. And it's one which is combined. Actually, I would say if you were interested in learning more about that, particularly around ADHD, you might be interested in the work of Peter Conrad. He's written a book called The Medicalization of Everyday Life. While he's looking more at the medicalization or the adult ADHD, what makes Conrad a powerful scholar, he's just recently retired, just this year, is his focus on medicalization. Now, when we talk about medicalization, often in the vernacular, we're just sort of saying, you know, doctors usurping things that maybe shouldn't be part of their brief. But medicalization is far more complex than that. It is, for example, about the terms we use to define a particular thing. If we start using medical terms rather than lay terms, already we're on the road towards medicalization. If the resources which are required to palliate a particular thing are held under, or medicine is the gatekeeper, then that's another important component of it. What I think is happening in ADHD in child psychiatry is an important, or a sort of perfect storm in a society which is understanding its health and illness progressively more and more via diagnostic labels, in a society where the pharmaceutical industry has amazing power and influence over how diseases are categorized and what treatment options are available. I think we have a heap of problems to face, particularly in pediatric psychiatry. David Healy is another author. He writes from a less theoretical perspective, but he's a psychiatrist who's written a significant amount about the influence of the pharmaceutical industry on diagnostic categories in children. There's a lot of, John Giardini is a pediatric psychiatrist out of Adelaide in Australia, who's been particularly interested in the problem of pediatric diagnoses. He is a clinician as well, and so sees it, I think, perhaps slightly simplistically as a bad big pharma problem. I think the problem is more complex than just big pharma out there to get us. I think the fact that we are increasingly more interested in diagnosis as a society, we open up the door for a big pharma to get its claws in. And so it is about the medicalization of society that makes this possible, and medicalization is not about bad guys with neckties sitting around a boardroom plotting. It's about a series of social parameters and contexts which enable us to think in these terms. Is that helpful to you?
Yeah, if I quickly come back.
Of course.
Just there was a lot of focus on big pharma and the companies and funding research, that nature of things. But one man said that he wanted a call for, like, he was calling for the ability to shift labels. So, like, as illnesses develop and progress, for example, with physical health, it's very easy to say, "Oh, I'm cured." Something. But when you're diagnosed with a mental illness, something that is very much stigmatized, remains with you, especially for children, like through the education system.
Yes. That you're stigmatized and you're branded. It stays with you for a long time. I think, and Felicity Thomas couldn't be here with us today, but she was speaking to me about a psychiatrist out of Plymouth who is trying to work in a non-diagnostic frame. And you might be interested, perhaps we could arrange for you to speak with Felicity, or maybe Mark can help us there. One of the things, and I often use it as a thought experiment, could we imagine a medicine without diagnosis, for example? It's a hard task. So much is linked to diagnosis. And while I'm not talking just about psychiatric diagnosis, though, is low-hanging fruit for the sociologist of diagnosis. No problem with that. But I think that the problems you talk about are also problems that are prevalent in physical medicine as well. So what we would lose if we no longer had diagnoses is we would no longer be able to generalize. So, for example, if you came to your doctor and you were having trouble breathing, he or she would listen to your lungs, would say, "Oh, that sounds spasmy. I wonder what works on spasmy lungs. We could try some, let's say, theophylline or caffeine. I understand that caffeine works good on spasmy lungs." But if we have criteria like bronchospasm, secretions, shortness of breath, and reduced oxygen saturation, which all fit into the diagnostic criteria for asthma, then it's really easy. We have a protocol for asthma, and we don't have to think about you as an individual case. We can say, aha, this is asthma. The first step to take in new onset asthma is X, Y, Z. So there are advantages to having diagnosis, but each time we use a general classification, apply a diagnostic label, we are classifying you. So we're putting you in a box, and you might be a square peg and it might be a round hole. So we are always saying you are more like this than you are like that, but we are obfuscating the individual nature of yourself by giving you the diagnostic category. So if we were to work without diagnosis ever, it would be a really hard job. There'd be a lot of mistakes. We wouldn't be able to generalize. We wouldn't be able to test whether things are working, because we would have no way of statistics is, of course, a method of generalization. So we couldn't see cause and effect. And yet at the same time, by diagnosing, we're turning you into an asthma case or a bipolar disorder or an ADHD. So these are things that are really important to be weighed up, and you're right about the permanence of labels, and there's lots more to be said.
Henry, can I just push you on a couple of things?
Yes.
Following up that, one is the issue about children is you focused on verbal narratives, and the question is what role does non-verbal in the case of ADHD?
Yep.
Or with attachment disorder or something.
Yep.
The narrative is constructed through observation of non-verbal behavior. Now, that may be determined partly by parental narratives, verbal narratives. But the question is, the first one is, and even in the novels and the books, you're talking about words still. And the question is how those narratives acted out or demonstrated through behavior. That was the first one. The second question came back to the question about AIDS, or Dora's point about risk. And that is the way you talk sometimes of the word diagnosis is as a moment.
Yes, of course. Yes. No, of course.
The diagnosis.
Caught.
There's a temporality.
You caught me.
Clearly, but there's a temporality to diagnosis as well. But, and how do you address that?
Yeah. So if I've understood your question, I'd like to start with the second one, because you caught me out quite well, as a matter of fact. It's no, it's good. And I think if I've understood you, if not, I'm about to admit something you haven't asked me to admit to. But you talked about the temporality of the diagnostic moment. And in fact, to say that there is a diagnostic moment is, of course, an abbreviation. It can be a diagnostic process. It can be drawn out. There's a lovely article by Sarah Nettleton and some other people. I don't even think she's the first author, so forgive me. I think it was I Knew Before They Told Me, and it was Social Science and Medicine. And what's interesting about that, well, I knew before they told me. However, they did tell me in the story, and so it's always a reconstruction. Yes, I knew it was that. Okay, you knew it was that now. And I don't know if you've ever, I had a recent interesting experience. I thought about autoethnographing me as clearly a mountain biker, if you didn't guess, and a hardcore sort of physical exercisey person. I sometimes get sore. And when I get sore, I have my body people to look after me. I have my osteopath or my massage therapist. I have people. And I was having, last summer, this thing, back pain waking me up at night. Apparently that's a red flag. So I went to my osteopath. So I would wake up with this very painful back during the night, would wake me up. It was, I couldn't turn over. And I saw my osteopath and I saw I just saw the people I normally see, thinking I'd been training too hard, I'd been doing this, I'd been doing that, and normally my body people make things like that go away, and they didn't go away, and my osteopath was nervous because apparently night pain is a red flag. Now, I don't understand, this is something, I'm staring at Mark because he's trained as a medical doctor, and I don't understand, there's so many things about the active body that I know cramp up at night. Of course I get cramps during the night. I'm an athlete. I know how that works. But back pain was a bad thing. So I went to my doctor. He said, I think you should see your doctor. So I went to my doctor and said, oh, back pain, that's a red flag. I'm sitting here going, oh. And I had to have x-rays and I had to have things. And so I could tell you the story with great joy because, of course, I'm not sore anymore. And they didn't find anything. They did find one thing. And actually that is relevant as well. They found, but I'll come back to that. But I can remember waiting in the x-ray thinking, what am I going to say about this in 2 weeks' time? Am I going to say, I knew before they told me? Or am I going to say, I knew it wasn't that? And I didn't know. I thought I should start writing. I should write about this. I should write about this. This may be my, last piece. It wasn't. But I can remember processing that in the same way as I talked to you about that young man in the front picture. You go thinking, oh, I'll be right. She'll be right. Oh, maybe not. But they did, in the process of their test, they did find something that I had been resisting being tested for all my life. I have a sister with ankylosing spondylitis. You know what that is. So it's it's an inflammatory spine disease, a form of arthritis. And I am usually associated with HLA-B27 tissue group. And I have also had iritis in my past. So I undoubtedly have HLA-B27, but I didn't want to know about it because I wasn't sure it was meaningful to know about it, and I wasn't sure what it would do to me to know about it. And of course, they tested it. Of course, I do have it, and now I have to know it. So now I have to know it. And along with that, I'm at risk for some other things that I haven't looked up. And I don't want to know it, including blindness and I don't know what. So now I know that. So what does that say about me? I spend more on my glasses. I see the optometrist every year when I would just wait until my glasses change anything other than it irritates me to know it. Because there's one label I didn't need. It doesn't help me. It doesn't change anything. I can't prevent it. And I didn't want to know. But I do. And my back isn't sore anymore. But that was not, so you calling me out, not calling me out, but pointing out that the diagnostic moment is not always that moment in front of the doctor, but at the same time, maybe it is. Because if
you're drawing parallels there between detective work with a denouement and medical investigation and a diagnosis. And in a sense, it just strikes me that might be misleading.
It might be simplistic. Yeah, it's slightly simplistic, do you think? I think I would agree it might be.
There's a lot, there's a lot in it, because a lot of historians have written about sort of Sherlock Holmes narrative of medicine and discovery. So there's obviously something, I think, significant about that analogy, but at the same time, it might condense a temporal experience into a moment unfairly.
Yes, fair enough. I think you're right. I think, though, as well, what you just described about the denouement, that was the medical work in the background. And so at one point there's that transfer, but there's also the patient work in the background. There's making the appointment. There's, can I have an MRI? There's getting the labs done. Oh crap, I wasn't fasting. Doing it a second time. You know, there's a lot of nonsense going on, and there are little bits and pieces that filter in. And if you've got, I don't know if in the NHS you can have access. I have something called Manage My Health, where I can see the lab tests come through. And the doctor will authorize me to see them. He'll see them first. If I need to be told, then he won't click the make visible button. But of course there are variations. So you look at them. I know I can read those labs, most of them. And I can say, oh yeah, that's a normal variation, not worried about that. Oh, I wonder what that means. Huh. Well, he let it through, so it mustn't be too serious. Now, this reminds me of the old days in the beginning of the HIV thing, I don't know what to call it, epidemic, or when HIV first started to raise its head. I worked in the infectious diseases clinic at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which is where I'm from originally. So what we would do if someone was going to be tested is when we drew their blood, we would also make a return appointment. And the reason we made a return appointment at the same time was because we didn't want to call people back and have them jump off a bridge. And that was literally the rationale. We wanted everyone to have a callback. So you would have your callback and you'd sit in the chair like that first painting, and you'd be told, no, you don't have anything. Well, why couldn't you just phone me? Well, I couldn't, because we had to put the structure around it so that no one would suspect that the reason for a callback was to announce bad news. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, one more last question.
Sorry to go again.
No.
There's definitely a sense, and to bring back the HIV story, but also things like cancer, there's a sense of a moment which there is a level of performativity. We're talking about reference, and it's not just it's not just that describing something that is happening. Is transformative, and it is transformative for the person hearing it, in the sense that you also said it just before and there's an after, and suddenly you know kind of suspension. That's something that changes at the kind of like level of being with a diagnosis like cancer or HIV, even if you can rationalize it. So there's a certain level of like theatrics, and it's quite interesting that you're talking about, you know, setting up a certain kind of like mise en scène.
Yes, of course.
To
announce a mise en scène for diagnosis. But there's already a mise en scène. But you haven't gotten to your question. I should let you go to your question. But don't you think there's already a mise en scène in the doctor's office, in the position, in the clothing, in the where you're allowed to sit, in the there's a whole performing in the what it is to be a doctor. And of course, depending on who the doctor is, my PHO, primary health organization, IC Chan or IC Chris, first name basis. I don't know if you do that in the UK or not. It's probably Dr. Sir, Mr., Mrs., Madam. We also have Misters, which I don't really understand. So if you're a surgeon, you're a Mr., whether your name's Kathy or Dave. So my good friend Kathy is a Mr. ENT surgeon. But there, we have, it's quite relaxed in New Zealand, and in my PHO they have, the locums are usually just young recent graduates. And of course there's the kind of squaring the shoulders and I'm a real doctor, and the fraud, the imposter syndrome that of course they feel, because they should. One does when one starts out in new shoes. But there are particular postures one takes, even from how one wears the stethoscope. Is it in the pocket around the neck, or swung around like that? You know, and so yes, it's a mise en scène. And my friend Tanya Jenkins has written very nicely about, it's American, which is even worse, because of course they wear white coat. Do you wear white coats? No. Yeah, all of my pictures were American stock photos, as you could tell, because they were wearing lab coats. But Tanya has written some very interesting work on the enactment of the roles. The consultants have the Mont Blanc pens in the pockets. whereas the med students have the ballpoints. The med students wear a short jacket, the docs wear an open lab coat. There's a whole set of ceremony symbols, signs around, around the characters in the particular scene. So, can I draw your attention to my Facebook page? It's not my Facebook page, it's a professional page, all focused on diagnosis in contemporary society in its many guises. I'm really eager to get more people reading it, contributing to it, making comments about things, feeding me, just as Lisa Sanders has to be fed weird and obtuse diagnoses from around the world. I need more material all the time, and I'm getting it. On this trip, I've gotten heaps of tidbits to put on the page, but I hope you'll keep feeding me with more, because there's so much to say about diagnosis and its narrative construction and its social consequences and its social construction, and in the impact it has on us as well people, on sick people, on clinicians, and in many aspects of everyday life.
We are going to end a fantastic paper, and I think we could talk for a long time, Anne-Marie. I think everybody has been stimulated and encouraged to think about things in different ways. We may not all be doctors, but I think we are capable of diagnosing. An excellent paper, an excellent presentation. So I'd like to just thank, and those online, if they can still hear, you can virtually clap, whatever you'd like to
Thank
do.
you for coming, you online.
Exactly, thank you.
Thank you so much.
So thank you also, very much. These seminars are very much about opening up discussions and connections, and you have done that beautifully.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.